Well, hey, Tarot loves, it's Liz. I'm back, and I wanted to introduce my new friends, David and Sana from New Zealand. These folks are experts in 13 sign astrology, and I've just gotten to know them recently, and I'm so fascinated with this new system. I'm more familiar with Western style astrology, and I've had a Vedic astrology read too. So I wanted to just begin to ask you guys questions. How are you doing today?
Really good.
Yeah, good. Thank you.
So great. Yeah, so I'll start off with the first question I have for you is, can you tell us briefly, how did you both get into 13 sign astrology?
I'll let David take the lead.
I love the laugh.
So, a little bit of a backstory. I am in that Gen X generation that is generally known in the kind of spiritual world as the indigos, the first indigos that came in. There are indigo children, but there are actually Gen Xs or indigos. They call us indigo warriors, right? So we were born at a very, very interesting time astrologically in the mid-60s, a lot of us. Between 64 and 67, there was a once in a probably forever conjunction between Pluto, who else? There was Uranus, there was Mars, and opposite was sitting Saturn conjunct Chiron. So this particular configuration probably will never be repeated again, certainly in our lifetimes, just because of the movement of all of the planets. So there was a bunch of us that, as higher selves, this is our belief, that we came in at that particular time, particularly in the 60s as kids, and in the generational structure we're called the Gen Xers. So I just thought I'd put that in there because that leads to how I got to 13 sign astrology. Then around age 11, literally, so we're talking about 75, 76, 77, where there's no internet, there's no cell phones, there's nothing. To learn, you have to read books. So I had what I would now look back on and say was a spontaneous spiritual awakening, where I suddenly found myself just in this incredibly euphoric state, which I now recognize as a partial Kundalini awakening. It just happened spontaneously. And up to that point, I had always been very intuitive as a child. A lot of those ESP type faculties were clairvoyance, clairaudience were already there very, very strongly. So because I had this at 11, I started to look into different modalities such as astrology, tarot, numerology, anything really in that divination space that would help me make sense of what was going on. So I came into a family that was not particularly spiritual. They were religious, in terms of they had a belief in God, but it was never anything that, we sat around the dinner table talking about. So as I had this experience, I had two brothers as well who didn't have that. I felt somewhat isolated, somewhat alone, a little bit of like, what on earth is going on? I was seeing visions. I would be able to look at situations. We were sitting around and talking at the dinner table, and parents would ask about something, and I'd go, there's the answer. And they'd go, how did you arrive at that? It was just that I had these faculties already online. And, when you then play it forward, many, many years into my 40s and 50s, I realized that what was happening actually was that I was having this partial sort of Kundalini awakening. So in other words, I was becoming much more aware of these spiritual practices, especially part of which was astrology. So my background from 11 onwards, literally, again, the context, no cell phones, no distractions. The TV used to go off at 6 o'clock at night. There was no evening television here in New Zealand at the time. So I was very curious and began to read and read and read and read for years. And so I read all of the big books that were out at the time about 12 sign astrology. In those days, there was no computer charts. You had to cast your own chart using mathematical calculations. So it was quite a laborious process. So I worked out that I was a Scorpio sun under that 12 sign system, a Gemini rising, and a Sagittarius moon. That was under the 12 sign system. We then play it forward for that's 12 to say 20. I did that investigation. So I spent about maybe 8 years reading and learning everything I possibly could about astrology. Again, not from the internet, from books. And I think that there's a different process that goes on in one's mind when you are reading as opposed to watching or listening. You're having to use different parts of the brain to absorb. It's also a much slower process of learning. So I felt that I had a very strong grounding in 12 sign astrology. I also realized that with the Scorpio sun, Sagittarius moon, and Gemini rising, that I had the 3 different modalities working. Of course, I had a air rising sign or ascendant, I had a fire moon, and I had a water sun. So when you take air, water, and fire, what I call now the golden triangle of expression, of personal expression, it's almost impossible to bring those 3 modalities together in a cohesive manner. It's very difficult to do. So in other words, my heart's going in one direction, my personality's going in another direction, and my head, my intellect's going in a third direction. So that began to create for me a lot of questions about, this doesn't make sense. I was already buying into the idea that as higher self, I chose to come in at that time, and I chose that configuration. I chose the exact moment of birth, which was 7:32 p.m. in what was then Rhodesia, now Zambia. And there was an incredible amount of questions that were being raised for me. And it took me from 20 to about 45, so another 25 years of struggling with that 12 sign configuration, when I finally stumbled across Lisa Renee's material. And she has done an amazing amount of research on a lot of different topics. If you're not familiar with her, she's all over the internet. She has the Wikipedia of spirituality. Basically, anything that you would ever possibly imagine is in there. So I, of course, looked up her views on astrology, and I stumbled across this 13th sign, which is Ophiuchus. And that led me to then, of course, we now have computer charts. So I was able to recast my chart, and I was like, oh my goodness, I'm not actually a Gemini rising, I'm a Taurus rising, which is an earth sign. I'm not a Scorpio sun, I'm actually a Libra sun. And I'm not a Sagittarius moon, I'm actually an Ophiuchus moon. So I was like, oh my goodness, I felt like at that moment, it's hard to describe, and Sana will talk about this as well. I just felt like, wow, suddenly everything that I've been learning up to that point, you've got to realize this was from 11 right through to about 45. So we're talking 30 something years. I realized that system, whilst it had some truth to it, and certainly had, there's a lot of crossover between the 2 systems, it never felt right to me. But the Ophiuchus moon, the more I read about it, particularly in the way that I emotionally and creatively deal with life, that was all Ophiuchus. Now, without taking too much more time, what I quickly say about Ophiuchus is that I have spent a lifetime in business, and this is an important context for the way that I see the world, which is that I am quite strongly left-brained, which is typically male, but I also have a lot of right-brain faculties, as I described before. But my tendency is to be a little skeptical. And so I like to test and, theorize and put things to the, into the fires of what else is out there. I try to actually, if I discover something like that, like Ophiuchus, I was like, what information is out there on the internet? What information is out there in the world that would debunk this? I mean, we'll talk about that a little later. And I went through a long process. And what I stumbled across was that the sun as it moves through its ecliptic, the sun clearly moves, our perspective of the sun moves, and it moves through all of these different constellations. Well, NASA came out with a tweet and a blog, which was hugely, it was picked up by the mainstream media at the time. This is still on the internet. All the big media channels ran the story and said, NASA has now said that Ophiuchus is part of the sun's ecliptic. So in other words, the sun spends time in this constellation. And, from a scientific point of view, it's preposterous to think that Ophiuchus constellation wasn't ever there. It was always there. Obviously, it was always there. But the sun moving through there brings a different perspective when you then look at astrology, because, this is the last piece I'll say about this, and we can explore this a little bit later, but the 12 sign system is what they call the Ptolemaic system. So it was developed and designed by Claudius Ptolemy, a historical figure who, in the times of the Greco-Roman Empire, devised the 12 sign system. And we know that the Greco-Roman Empire was very scientific, it was very left-brained, it was very patriarchal. And the idea that the source consciousness or the universal intelligence, or whatever word you use to describe your relationship with the, God consciousness, whatever it is, to me, my own personal interpretation of it was that it is inconceivable that a system could be developed by source itself. In other words, us understanding the movement of the constellations and what that can mean for us as archetypes. It's inconceivable that the sun would only spend 30 days in a nice, neat circle around the ecliptic, and it spends 30 days in each sign. And therefore, 12 signs, 30 degrees, 1 degree is 1 day, 30 days, you come up with 360 days, more or less, you come up with 12 months. So the science behind it was a little funky, to be honest, was my research. And I thought, well, that doesn't match up with my understanding of source, which is about diversity. You look at the genetics in humanity, you look everywhere, there's diversity. And how could it be that this system was just so succinct and so precise? And of course, when I researched that, it then came back to the fact that this was designed by the Roman Empire, or Ptolemy, who was an advisor to the state, again, a historical figure. You can look all of this up. And he inserted actually Libra to make the 12 sign astrology work, because it didn't work. Now, there's a whole lot of other stuff we can talk about, which may or may not come up today, about why Ophiuchus was removed. And it's to do with the divine feminine, and the name Ophiuchus changed to Asclepius. Asclepius is the father of medicine, and the rod and staff caduceus symbol was hijacked, in my opinion, by the Romans at that time. That whole symbology went from Ophiuchus, which is actually the rising of the Kundalini and the snake, up the rod of the spine. That's the awakening process. That caduceus symbol is now associated with Asclepius rather than Ophiuchus.
And with
Asclepius,
science, right? And when science took it over, yes.
Yeah, and the male personification of this divine feminine energy was basically ripped apart, or the feminine was transposed into a masculine expression. So that is also a big part of why I think that 13, which is obviously relating to the feminine energy, was removed, because it just was so inconsistent with the patriarchal worldview that Ptolemy and the Romans had at the time. We know that the Roman Empire is the basis or the root of Western thinking, whether it's philosophy, whether it's science, whether it's politics, whether it's social theories, medicine, technology. It's all come out of that Roman, epoch, if you like. So that's how I came to an understanding of it. And I'll leave it there, and because Sun has got obviously a different pathway, which is again just as fascinating.
David, that's great. That's just brilliant. I love hearing about your journey because it's often in our early 40s, isn't it, where we have our own personal awakening. So your own hero's journey led you there when you're ready to take on the mantle, and take on your hero's journey. And now you have a tribe around you. In other words, Sana as well, probably as other people. Thank you so much. Sana, how about you?
Well, astrology has been part of my upbringing. Always it was actually my paternal grandfather that was already into astrology. So, a man from the early 1910s, 1920s found his way to that. He used a 12 sign system, as the majority of the people on the planet do. But because of that, my mum always used it as well. I remember as a child that she had the charts computer generated already at that stage. And my auntie, so the sister of my mum, is actually a professional astrologer. That's how she earns her living, using 12 sign astrology. And so I grew up believing that my sun was in Libra, that my rising sign was Sagittarius, and that my moon was in Cancer. And so the Sagittarius, once I moved to New Zealand, that was my travel, my outdoors, I made it fit. And the Libra being the, always weighing off and being kind, my interpretation of Libra at that time. And I am a mother of 2 children, and I thought my daughter was a Taurus because of when she was born, and my son would be a Leo with his sun in Leo. And so again, I made it fit how a lot of people do that. You kind of feel that it's not quite right, but that may be some other aspect of my chart. And there was one of the early conversations that David and I had over the phone. And I asked him, so when is your birthday? And he said, the 14th of November. So I'm like, so you're a Scorpio. And he went, no, I'm a Libra. I'm like, like what? But 14th of November is Scorpio. He said, no, it's under the 13th sign. It is Libra. And I was like, what does then mean for me thinking I was a Libra? And I remember so clearly, he said, are you sure you want to know? Because it can be life-changing. And I wanted to know. And he drew up my chart using a website. And yes, my sun is in Virgo, my rising sign is Scorpio, and my moon is in Gemini. And yeah, just that sense of coming home of, now I understand how when I do go through a sad part, that depth that we can go into, and I just keep going down, I'm like, that's the Scorpio energy in me. That's in my managerial, my, coordination and managing, that's my Virgo. It's like, that
I know
makes
your
sense.
Virgo side. I know your Virgo side.
Yeah. And so it was just fascinating. And the other thing that I really appreciate of being introduced to this new form of astrology to me is the use of some of the fixed stars, including Arcturus and Sirius. And Sirius is one of those ones that can also have quite a bad rep. But everything we can use light and dark, and we see Sirius as the Sirian energy, the science energy, that the looking at things in a scientific way, and the Arcturus energy is the healers of the universe. I was going to say of the world, but of the universe. And I have Arcturus star on my sun, and I have Sirius on my moon, and that has given me permission to tap into the healing abilities that I have. It's like, oh my gosh, that makes so much sense now. And I'll just tell you one more little story that I had with my mum. So my mum, as I said, has been in astrology her whole life. And at that time she was 68, that we had this conversation. And I was going through a difficult part of my life. And she said, I think that is because Uranus is making a transit with blah, 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 blah. And I looked at her and I was like, oh my gosh, here's this woman that's been using 12 sign astrology for the last 68 years. How am I going to say that I do not subscribe to that anymore? How do I say that? And so I said, Mom, I don't believe that anymore. And she kind of looked at me. She said, what do you mean? I'm like, I now believe in 13 sign astrology, the true position of the planetary bodies in the zodiac. And she looked at me, she said, what do you mean? I'm like, well, my sun is in Virgo. And she, what? What? And she said, can you do mine? And so she lived her life really trying to fit her life. And I'm sure she doesn't mind me sharing. She made her life fit to be a sun in Pisces and Gemini rising and Taurus moon. She made it fit. And she, you know, she was like, oh, my knee is this, and my ability to quick think is my this. So she made it really fit, but it really didn't feel right. And so when I drew up her chart, and it turned out that she had her sun in Aquarius and her moon in Aries, you know, that fiery emotional tendencies that she clearly has had her whole life. It was almost like she dropped 10 pounds. She's like, oh my gosh, this makes so much sense. And in the 3 years that she now uses this knowledge, she's able to understand her actions, the way that she sees the world, the way she interacts with people so much more. And it's been so liberating. And also to understand my children, you know, going from my son thinking he was a Leo, a fiery individual, to being Cancer. He's actually a triple water. He has his sun and moon in Cancer, and his rising sign is in Pisces. And he is the most intuitive, emotional soul that I have in my life. And then to think that if we wouldn't be using this, we would be like, oh no, but he's a Leo, you know, you trying to then push him into that way. And I think that is the biggest crime when it comes to astrology, and even to some respect tarot, and you and David will know more about that. But the people who use these modalities to understand the lifetime that we've chosen, you know, we are hoping to live up to our divine design for this lifetime. And so we use 12 sign astrology thinking, so this is my path. This will make me do better, get me closer to my end goal. But they've got the wrong recipe book, right? Because they changed it. And for whatever reason they changed it. And so I think it is such a shame that people think that they are on the right path. But if only they knew that they have the wrong recipe book for this lifetime. And if they would be willing to and be open to seeing it differently, I think the whole of humanity would be able to accelerate to the restoration of this planet a lot faster.
I love these stories, and I love that your mom was so open and she didn't just shut you down. That's her cup half empty, right? As we talk about, I think that's beautiful. I love these stories. And so what I'm hearing from both of you is that if you have a sign and you find that you have in your life, like I've been trying to do with Taurus, I thought I was on the cusp between Aries and Taurus. I'm like, where's the Taurus part of me? I must want to be a homebody, but I don't feel like it. Anyway, I see that if you have found that in your astrological chart in the Western system, you haven't been fitting, you've been trying to force a fit, that actually looking into the 13th sign of Ophiuchus could ease up and make just where you really feel like you're home.